welcome to this talk on Introduction to Japanese Buddhism. We have been covering a lot of ground in this series. The first lecture was on basic introduction to Buddhism. The next lecture was on Mahayana Buddhism. We did one on Pure Land Buddhism and the thought of Shinran. And now we're doing kind of a general overview of Japanese Buddhism, and in the future we'll continue exploring different topics. I am very lucky at my university because I get to design courses kind of on whatever I am excited to learn about. Right? I teach here at University at Albany, and the person who was here before me was Mark Blum. And when I got the job here, I asked my colleagues, what courses do you need me to teach? And they said, Mark just taught whatever he felt like, so you can do that too. And I was like, oh, great. So I've taught classes on, introduction study of religion, kind of a survey, as well as, theory and method in the academic study of religion, introduction to Japanese religions, East Asian Buddhism. I have a seminar on the Lotus Sutra, a seminar on Zen. Right now I'm teaching a seminar on Pure Land Buddhism. And in the past, I've also taught a seminar on Esoteric Buddhism. So those are sort of my areas of interest in teaching, and perhaps in the future, we'll develop some other lectures like that. So if you have any questions about the content today that we don't get to in our chat later, please feel free to shoot me an email here, aproffitt@albany.edu. So let's get started. One of the first topics I like to address when we're thinking about Japanese Buddhism is the issue of sectarianism. Okay, today in Japan, sectarianism is a major feature of Japanese Buddhism, and because Japanese scholarship on Buddhism in East Asia has been so prolific and influential, people often think of East Asian Buddhism as if it were broken up into discrete schools or sects of Buddhism. Over the last few decades, scholars have done a lot of work to dispel that notion, but it's still kind of an entrenched way of thinking about Buddhism. Sectarianism, as we know it today, really develops in Japan after 1600. Immediately preceding this era was what we call the Warring States period, and during this period, there was a lot of political disunity, fighting between different groups. So once there was kind of a reunification of Japan, the government implemented various, new laws regulating how religious organizations were organized. And suddenly we have the establishment of, head temples and branch temples, and this kind of hierarchical organization with each shu being a distinct sectarian lineage or institution or school, right? And from this point on, sectarianism becomes a major feature of Japanese Buddhism. You study your own teachings, you study the teachings of your founders. Don't debate with these other people, don't argue with these other people, because it's not peaceful, right? So kind of this government regimentation, right? In the modern period, with because Japan modernized so quickly and then adapted the kind of Western style university model, the temple seminaries of the Tokugawa era get kind of blended with this, kind of regimented approach to the study of Buddhism, where you have Indian Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, all these different categories. So this kind of, way of categorizing Buddhism really develops both on a Japanese model and on kind of a Western Buddhist studies model. And that actually creates problems for thinking about how these different areas of study and specialization would overlap and influence one another, right? Before 1600 and throughout the rest of East Asia, we see the fluid interaction between different areas of studies, different disciplinary specialties across and within different temples and lineages and so on. Before 1600 in Japan, the term shu means something more like an area of study, an area of disciplinary focus, or perhaps the essence of a teaching or lineage. And before 1600 in Japan and throughout the rest of East Asia today, sectarianism as such, as we understand it today, as it developed in 1700s in Japan, was really not much of a major issue. So because I'm talking about pre-modern Japanese religion, this is one thing to keep in mind, is that we're not really talking about sectarian institutions that are distinct from one another, but rather areas of inquiry, study, and specialization that you might study broadly. So let's look at a couple of these that we might be thinking about. So one of the other questions to ask ourselves is, what are temples for, right? In early Japanese history, what is a temple for, right? And what do monks do? And then here are some of the other areas of specialization, kind of broadly conceived, that you might encounter when you study Buddhism, pretty much anywhere, right? So one of the first areas of concern is Vinaya. Vinaya refers to the rules regulating monks and nuns, your behavior, comportment, diet, clothes you wear, the style of bed you can have, and so on. One of the reasons why the Vinaya is so important is because one of the things that monks do is cultivate a pure lifestyle so that they are in contact with the spiritual power of a Buddha, the bodhisattvas, the gods, and so on, right? So living under the Vinaya laws and regulations, then a monk is able to then chant the sutras, the Buddhist scriptures, perform spells, or dharani, or mantra, and these are supposed to give, bestow benefits, right? So if the ruler or the emperor is concerned with, prolonging their lifespan, the monks may be employed to chant the sutras for that. Or if there's been a drought, perhaps the monks will chant the sutras or spells in order to do a rain-making ritual, or things like that, right? One of the other things we might see monks doing is preaching, right? So going out on the road, preaching the sutras, preaching, different Buddhist practices, but also sometimes that preaching is done explicitly for the purpose of fundraising, right? Somebody's got to help keep the lights on, or so to speak, keep the monks fed and clothed, keep the big beautiful temples in repair, and so on. And in that connection, there are also temple administrators, right? In some cases, lay people might take those administrative positions. In other cases, there are certain monks that were effective administrators for these large landholding institutions we now may call temples. Some monks are well known for their civil engineering efforts to build lakes and direct rivers and so on. There are various stories about the monk Kukai, here pictured, who was not only a great philosopher and ritual master, but also regarded as a civil engineer who did various projects that would help the local people. Some monks are known for writing what we might call great philosophical treatises on Buddhist doctrine, so doctrinal study, philosophy, textual exegesis, and things like that are some of the other things that monks may do. And then, of course, meditation, right? Probably, many people, when they first hear about Buddhism, the first thing they think of is meditation. Yes, meditation is important. It's very diverse in many different forms of meditation, things you do with your body and your mind to achieve these deep states of awareness. But meditation practice takes place in an institutional context that we should also keep in mind, and is often carried out along with all of these other things as well. So look next at some of the major time periods in Japanese Buddhism. Many textbooks and presentations will begin by telling you about the different sects and schools. Remember, sect and school are very fluid at this time, so that's not necessarily the best way to organize it. And then you also have time period. Maybe there's Nara Buddhism or Heian Buddhism or Kamakura Buddhism and so on. But even this time period model is somewhat problematic and limiting for talking about how these different traditions kind of flow into each other, build upon one another, and so on. One of the other issues with this way of breaking up Japanese Buddhist history is that we have a few different capitals, right? So the early Japanese capital is established in Nara, and then the capital is moved a couple times and eventually set in the Heian capital. And actually, Heian remains the seat of, if not political, then certainly cultural capital, where the emperor and the aristocrats were living, all the way until 1868. So that that's one thing that kind of continues on. But even during the Heian period, so-called, the institutions established during the Nara period remain the dominant institutions. By the time we get to the Kamakura period as well, the Shingon and Tendai lineages and institutions often overlapping with the institutions established in Nara, they remain the dominant traditions. But during the Kamakura period, new movements, new perspectives on the study and practice of Buddhism, we might call Pure Land, Zen, and Nichiren traditions, they get started during the Kamakura period, but it's not really until the later periods that they really make their presence known and really start to influence Japanese Buddhism. So even during the Kamakura period, the dominant traditions remain those institutions and lineages founded in earlier periods, right? And then we get to the Tokugawa period, and we have, all of these different, temples and institutions and this kind of hierarchical organization of each of these different lineages and approaches to Buddhism, but also the importation of new forms of Buddhism, such as the Obaku school from China. So a Chinese Ming Dynasty style form of Buddhism that's then brought in even after, Zen lineages were already flourishing in Japan. So this is another way of organizing the study of Japanese Buddhism. But just remember that all of these different organizing heuristics have their strengths and weaknesses. Let's start off with this early period, the Nara schools, right, starting in the early 700s. The establishment of Buddhism in Japan came through intercultural dialogue with Korea and then eventually China. And in addition to building large temples and a temple network system throughout the realm, the emperor also wanted people to study those things that, the center of the Buddhist world, China, study those things that, the great Buddhist thinkers of China were working on. So here are some of the important areas of study that people might have worked on. One important thing to keep in mind is, again, that, during a monk's career, they may study all of these or some of these, right? To my college students, I explain it's kind of like how you might have a major, you might change majors, you might double major, you might take some general education requirements, you don't take your math class necessarily to become a mathematician or an introduction to Japanese religions class to become a scholar of Japanese religion, but rather you take each of these classes to have a broad base of knowledge with which you can then, pursue your particular area of interest. So monks and scholars may specialize in particular areas of study, but throughout their career, they may draw upon each of these, right? So real quickly, the first one, Kegon, is an area of study focused on the Avatamsaka Sutra. The Avatamsaka Sutra presents this grand vision of limitless worlds throughout the 10 directions, with limitless Buddhas and limitless Bodhisattvas, coursing through the multiverse, guiding beings to awakening. So on the one hand, there's this grand, diverse vision of the universe, but also a sense of unity and oneness, where all of these worlds are interconnected with one another. The Buddha, the kind of cosmic Buddha, the Buddha as cosmos, we might even say, found within the Avatamsaka Sutra, is here depicted as the Daibutsu of Nara. Somewhere on my hard drive, I have a picture of a monk like mopping the hand, like it's it's so big that he's standing on the hand and mopping it. It's kind of hard to get a sense of just how massive this thing is if you're not standing in front of it. It's truly impressive, but also it imparts this idea of kind of the grandeur of the Buddhist view of reality, right? With each of these little Buddhas kind of representing different worlds, and they can all together, they are represented anthropomorphically by this Buddha Vairochana, right? We'll talk more about that later. Other schools, Yogacara and Madhyamaka, or Hosso and Sanron, these are kind of East Asian approaches to the study of two major Mahayana philosophical traditions. Yogacara, kind of an early form of Buddhist psychology. Within Yogacara, you study how eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, organs of sense perception encounter objects of sense perception, and this gives rise to different layers of consciousness that then lead to our particular karmic tendencies and abilities and inclinations and so on. And so you kind of study how the mind works to break down that process and see the world as it truly is. Madhyamaka, founded by the great monk Nagarjuna, focuses on the philosophy of emptiness, that all things are, as we encounter things in the world, we tend to project essences and imagine, inherent qualities to things, but in fact, all things are fluid, impermanent, dynamic, dependent upon other things. No thing is self-arising, no thing is self-created. So by studying the teaching of Nagarjuna, or the three treatises, the Sanron, one comes to understand the nature of emptiness. And as Nagarjuna famously said, for whom shunyata, or emptiness, is possible, all things are possible. Which I take to mean that when you understand the fluid nature of reality, you're not so stuck, and you can do great things, right? And there are many important ways that both Yogacara and Madhyamaka influence broadly the whole of Mahayana Buddhism, Japanese Buddhist traditions included. Next, again, we have Ritsu, which is the Vinaya again, and the Vinaya is the rules for monks and nuns. There are monks who are Vinaya specialists, or Vinaya revivalists. Some monks who come along and say, you monks are not following the Vinaya correctly. We need to get back to basics. Too many of you monks are out here drinking and partying and all that. And a scholar was reading one of these texts from the 8th century, and everybody kind of looked around at each other. Many of the people in the room were actually Buddhist priests. Are like, yeah, it's still kind of like that. I just thought that was really funny. And then we have two other areas of study, Satya Siddhi and Abhidharma Kosha. These are important non-Mahayana schools of Buddhism that frankly don't exert that much influence on Japanese Buddhism, but just know that kind of broadly, monks were broadly educated, studying many different areas of study, whether they be kind of practical things like how to run a temple, how monks should dress and comport themselves, philosophy, psychology, metaphysics, whatever, however you might want to categorize these. Monks are studying broadly and thinking broadly across institutions. Many of the great temples like Todaiji or Kofukuji would have, perhaps specialists in one or more of these areas of study, but then also have, so monks would, study different things within these temples, study different things across these temples, and that really kind of sets the model for most of Japanese history, where people are, studying with different masters and different traditions. So let's continue. One of the traditions that is established later on comes with the new capital, right? So as the emperor is building a new capital, he also wants to send monks back to China to see what is, the hip, new, cool Buddhist stuff going on in China. One of the monks that gets sent on this delegation to China is named Kukai, also known as Kobo Daishi. And he went and studied the Tantras, or what we sometimes call Esoteric Buddhism. And he brought that back to Japan. According to some traditions, it said that he had a 20-year budget and he spent it in 2. So because perhaps some of these Tantras had already been, trickling into Japan from China, Kukai probably knew what he was looking for and went after it. So he brought back beautiful mandalas like the one pictured here, representing, this is called the womb realm mandala, representing the universe in its quiescent state. We have the Buddha at the center, Mahavarochana, symbolizing again kind of this cosmic principle, right? That all Buddhas, all Bodhisattvas, all gods, all beings, and all forms are the body of Mahavarochana, and that is symbolized by the mudras and hand movements that monks might do during ritual. During through learning these esoteric rituals, one also acquires mantras, and mantras are said to be the speech of Buddha, the speech of Buddha reality. All sound, all speech is said to be the mantra, the great cosmic mantra of the Buddha, Mahavarochana. And then, mandalas and other kind of visualization practices help one realize that all mind, all mentation, all thought is the mind of Buddha, Mahavarochana. So there's a kind of monism there, I guess you could say, that all things are really united in this great Buddha, Mahavarochana. I heard of a temple in a Shingon temple in Hawaii that supposedly has the middle seat here blank because you are the Buddha in the center of the mandala, right? Which is one of the things we see within tantras. Now, tantras are often misunderstood, often misinterpreted, but tantras are one of many genres of ritual texts that come from South Asia. You have Buddhist tantra, Hindu tantra, Jain tantra, tantric traditions that kind of blend and borrow between these. And Kukai was able to go study in China at a time when Indian tantric masters were present in China, and Kukai was able to study with them. Two important concepts we associate with Kukai's teaching is one, Hoshin Seppo. Hoshin Seppo is the idea that the Dharmakaya teaches, that the universe itself teaches, that you don't have to have, Buddha reality may accommodate the needs and inclinations of different people in different times and appear in whatever form is most appropriate for you. That's kind of basic Mahayana knowledge. But one of the things that's kind of innovative with Kukai is saying that the Dharmakaya itself can preach, right? And that's what the esoteric teachings realize, is this understanding that body, speech, and mind, through the practice of mudra, mantra, and visualization practices, beings can realize that they are already one with Buddha reality, right? And through that realization, one attains Buddhahood in this body, also known as Sokushin Jōbutsu, right, to become Buddha in this body. But in a sense, it's not becoming Buddha in this body because you already are Buddha. The universe is Buddha, correctly understood. One of the really important places associated with Kukai is Koyasan. Koyasan is a mountain retreat center that Kukai wanted to establish in order for his monks to engage in dedicated study of the teachings that he brought back with him. And he was eventually given it, and Koyasan comes to be regarded as a pure land within this world, a place that has perhaps portals to the pure lands of different Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, these kind of paradisical realms where you can pursue the Bodhisattva path more easily. Right? So let us continue. One of the other important figures who goes to China around the same time as Kukai is Saicho. Saicho's boat unfortunately gets blown off course, so he ends up studying in the Tiantai Mountains. The Tiantai mountain range is associated with the teachings of Zhi, a great monk who lived a few hundred years before Saicho. Zhi had important relationships with the emperor and was working in China at a time where people are trying to figure out how to deal with the diversity of Buddhism, right? Buddhism didn't come into China as one thing or one time, was not systematically presented by Indian Buddhist delegations necessarily. Different teachings and traditions flowed into China, by sea, by land, over the desert, over the mountains. And Zhi was one of these people who tried to create a comprehensive doctrinal and meditative system that allowed for this diversity to cohere, right? How does this all fit together? Zhi's comprehensive doctrinal system, which Saicho brought back, the term is Tiantai in China, Tiantai Shan, the Tiantai Mountains, which is pronounced Tendai in Japan, right? So Saicho brings back this Tendai lineage that is focused on the teachings of Zhi, and the teaching of Zhi also focus on the Lotus Sutra as one of these teachings that shows you how within the diversity of the Buddhist tradition, there is a kind of unity, and that unity is all about the Bodhisattva path, that all beings are on the path to awakening, even if they don't know it. One of the other things that we find in Tiantai's comprehensive meditation system are certain Pure Land practices. He presents this 90 days of constant walking, constant sitting, both sitting and walking, neither sitting nor walking. And during this intense meditative practice period, if your mind, you get tired, losing concentration, you would chant the name of the Buddha Amitabha. As a result of this inclusion of chanting or contemplating the Buddha, Chinese Tiantai and Japanese Tendai actually produce important, Pure Land lineages, institutions, traditions. Pure Land movements often draw upon the teachings of Chinese Tiantai and Japanese Tendai practice. One of the other things that Saicho studies is the esoteric ritual traditions, just like what Kukai brought, right? So Saicho returns before Kukai, begins teaching the esoteric rituals, but then Kukai comes back, and it's quickly realized that in fact, Kukai has more training in the esoteric rituals than Saicho. But then disciples of Saicho and other Tendai monks go back to China, stay longer, study more, and then eventually establish themselves as the dominant esoteric tradition. Actually, not just esoteric Buddhism, but the mountain where Saicho establishes his tradition, Mount Hiei, could almost be considered the Vatican of Japan until it's burned down during the Warring States period. So Tendai is an important vehicle for promoting Pure Land traditions, esoteric traditions, study of the Lotus Sutra, and various other things. One of the other things is that Saicho promoted the Bodhisattva precepts. There's another way of thinking about the Vinaya that kind of simplifies things, and also gave him an opportunity to train his own monks in his own way. Kukai taught the esoteric traditions kind of through the Nara monastic bureau. He was, a good team player, you might say. Saicho wanted to do things in his own way. Saicho wanted to teach his monks in his own way, apart from the monastic bureaucracy. Initially, this posed a lot of difficulties for him and his community, but eventually set the precedent for them to really dominate the scene eventually. So let us continue. After the Heian period, which is when Shingon and Tendai traditions are established and flourish within kind of the two capitals of Nara and Kyoto. During the early medieval period, we see the rise of the samurai and the creation of new schools of Buddhism. In Japan today, over here, the so-called new schools of Pure Land, Zen, and Nichiren, they tend to dominate the scene, and therefore they get to kind of write the history of Japanese Buddhism. The problem is, during the actual Kamakura period, 1300s, the so-called old schools were still the dominant traditions. So Tendai, Shingon, Keigon, Sanron, and Hoso, and others were still the dominant traditions, both in terms of ritual performance, engagement with the laity, intellectual, artistic, and other impact. So, to study the Kamakura period, yes, certainly, look at these new schools, they're very interesting, but to get a really good handle on what was really going on in the Kamakura period, you've got to focus on the so-called old schools, because they were still the dominant traditions. I'm a scholar of Kamakura Buddhism, and I'm really interested in this debate about the new schools and old schools and how they function together within this time period. Let's talk about some of these new schools. So each of the new school founders, whether we're talking the Pure Land monks, the Nichiren monks, or the Zen monks, each of them began their careers studying Tendai on Mount Hiei. Again, you could really think of Mount Hiei and the Tendai tradition as kind of like the Vatican of Japan, right? But again, Tendai is a comprehensive Mahayana system, so it's kind of all-inclusive. Everything is all included there. So many scholars have been debating how to think about the relationship between Tendai Buddhism, a so-called old school tradition, and Pure Land, Zen, and Nichiren as so-called new traditions. Some scholars have suggested that these new schools were rejecting Tendai due to elitism or decadence or something else. This is problematic in a number of ways. There may be some truth to it, but the idea that these old schools were elitist or out of touch with the needs of ordinary people, or that they were declining in importance, is simply not true. It's a much more complicated situation. Others have looked at the Tendai tradition as kind of the womb from which these new schools evolved. Concepts like original enlightenment, that Buddhahood is already present within us and all around us. We just need a simple practice to help us wake up to that reality. This is something we see expressed within Pure Land Zen and Lotus Sutra traditions as well. These simple practices, a singular practice that is the path to awakening, right? So clearly this is based in some ways on certain Tendai teachings regarding original enlightenment. But again, others have suggested that there is something more like a dialectical emergence where Tendai is the thesis, reformers like Honen are kind of an antithesis, and then monks like Shinran, Dogen, and Nichiren represent the synthesis of these ideas, right? So perhaps we can kind of unpack some of these ideas in the next half of today's talk. Some scholars have suggested that Honen is the first of the Kamakura Buddhist reformers, and that's perhaps true. Honen studied broadly in the Kenmitsu curriculum of Mount Hiei. So the word Kenmitsu means exoteric and esoteric. That means that he studied the esoteric rituals, was well versed in them, but also studied broadly the various kind of ordinary teachings, kind of the surface level teachings, whether it's the Lotus Sutra or the Pure Land Sutras or whatever. So very broadly trained, broadly well versed. It said that he read the Buddhist canon 3 times, and trying to find what is the essential teaching for this difficult time that we live in. Early medieval Japan, with the rise of the samurai class, the political instability that brought, with famine and plague and Mongolian invasion that comes later on, a lot of uncertainty, and people are wondering, do the old forms of Buddhism still work? Have we entered a time of decline where traditional forms of practice are no longer effective? What are we supposed to do? So Honen establishes what's called the Jodo Shu. Rather than think of Jodo Shu as a sect of Japanese Buddhism, you could perhaps think of Jodo Shu as an area of study within the broader Tendai curriculum, where you focus primarily upon the teachings of the Pure Land and other ideas like that. Honen wanted people to focus exclusively on the Nembutsu. Nembutsu is the chanting of the name of the Buddha, Namo Amida Butsu. Honen's idea seems to be something like this, that if Buddha represents perfect wisdom and compassion, which is a greater representation of that wisdom and compassion? Extremely difficult, complicated rituals and doctrines that only the elite have access to, or a simple practice that all beings have access to. So basically what Honen kind of does is takes the government out of your religion. You no longer have an intermediary, because it's just you and the Buddha. It's just you and the universe, this kind of universal compassion that guides all beings to awakening. Initially, he's popular with laity, with aristocrats. He's someone who actually did significantly impact his own time period. Was well read, widely well regarded. Yeah, but because of perceived slights by some of his disciples, the powers that be at Mount Hiei and the old capital of Nara, the elite temples were finally able to exile and persecute the Pure Land movement. But interestingly enough, just as with the persecution of Christianity in the Roman Empire, it seems to be that the persecution led to some sympathy among people, and this led to the proliferation of Pure Land lineages and traditions. Briefly, I want to mention two of the popular Pure Land lineages. One is the Chinsei-ha, the other is the Seizan-ha. The Chinsei-ha was founded by Honen's disciple Bencho, and their tradition developed this idea that the Nembutsu and other practices ultimately lead to rebirth. So rather than exclusive reliance on the Nembutsu, rather the Nembutsu becomes the foundation upon which other practices are understood to be effective. This is similar to the teaching of the Seizan-ha, associated with Shoku, one of Honen's other disciples. Shoku's approach to the Pure Land path left a lot of the esoteric traditions we associate with Tendai very much in place. And that makes him very interesting in that regard. He regarded the Nembutsu as the site where the Buddha's awakening and being's practice ultimately become one. So Nembutsu is not a mechanistic thing that makes me get to the Pure Land, or rather, the practice of the Nembutsu is Buddha's awakening. Right? Buddha is not awakened unless we're all awakened. Right? And also, by taking refuge in the Nembutsu, all practices become Nembutsu. So this is a way of kind of maintaining that diversity of practice, while also establishing the Nembutsu as the foundation for practice. One of Honen's major disciples, during his lifetime, Shinran was probably a minor disciple, but goes on to become a very important figure in Japanese Buddhism. This is Shinran. Shinran is the founder of Jodo Shinshu, the largest school of Japanese Buddhism today. The name Jodo Shinshu is often translated as the true Pure Land sect, but it'd perhaps be more accurate to think of it as the essence of the Pure Land teaching. Shinran, like Honen, like the other great founders, trained broadly in the Kenmitsu teachings of Mount Hiei, including Tendai and Keigon philosophy, meditation, esoteric ritual, and so on. Shinran was perhaps a practitioner of the constant practice samadhi on Mount Hiei, which is a kind of esoteric Tendai Pure Land practice said to lead to realization of the non-duality between Buddhas and ordinary beings. Again, possibly least well known during his lifetime, but ends up becoming very important. He was exiled along with Honen and the others. He had a powerful realization of his own finitude, the desire to go live the life of an ordinary person while still, pursuing a robust Buddhist life. He married the great nun Eshini, and lived life as neither monk nor layman, thus creating a new template for what it means to be a Buddhist professional. I want to mention briefly his wife Eshimi and his daughter Kakushimi, because without them, we probably wouldn't know about Shinran. Without Eshimi, who's financially supported Shinran's life and career, Shinran was then able to, establish communities throughout northern Japan. The Letters of Eshimi, translated by James Dobbins in this great book, give us some insight into her belief in being a woman in the Pure Land, because some people debated whether or not it was possible to be a woman in the Pure Land. And also she provides some interesting details about Shinran's life. But it was their daughter, Kakushimi, who established the first mausoleum dedicated to her father, around which these disparate Shin communities eventually coalesced. I'm going to skip some of the Shin doctrine I was going to talk about in the interest of time, but please see my other video on those issues. Around the same time, we also have the establishment of Chinese Zen style lineages. Zen had come to be the dominant tradition of China around this time, especially the Lingji Chan lineage, which is pronounced Rinzai in Japanese. Eisai, like Honen, like Shinran, was trained in the broader Kenmitsu curriculum of Mount Hiei. During his lifetime, he was actually widely regarded as an expert in Taimitsu, or Tendai Esoteric Buddhism. But then he traveled to China, acquired knowledge of Chinese tea culture, transmitted to things like the tea ceremonies, often attributed to him, as well as great Tiantai texts, a new infusion of Tiantai doctrine and so on. And along the way, also picked up certification in the Lingji Chan lineage. Lingji Chan is often associated with koan practice, which is kind of teacher, student, disciple dialogues, and then kind of focusing on the way that teachers and disciples would engage in spontaneous repartee, and how that reveals non-dualistic thinking that breaks down the idea of mechanistic approaches to meditation, or simplistic, superficial approaches to Buddhist practice, to really see the truth. Right? One of the key terms we associate with Rinzai Zen is Kinsho Jobutsu, to see your nature and thus become Buddha. One of the other great Zen thinkers is Dogen, who's associated with the Soto Zen school. There's a film about him that came out a few years ago. It's really fun. You should check it out. Again, like these other great founders, he was trained broadly in the Kenmitsu tradition of Mount Hiei. Traveled to China to study Chan after expressing some dissatisfaction with his training, and then learning a bit about Rinzai, and he wanted to go learn more. So he goes to China and encounters the Caodong lineage, which is one of the other major Chinese lineages. Caodong practice focused on silent illumination. So rather than the rigorous study of koan, or teacher-student dialogues, rather it's kind of allowing one's innate luminosity, one's innate Buddha nature to shine forth. Dogen emphasizes Zazen, and there's this key concept called shikantaza, or just sitting, which seems to lead to this understanding that the practice of meditation and the attainment of awakening are not two separate things, that the practice of meditation doesn't just lead to awakening, but the practice of meditation is itself in some way awakening. You don't meditate to become a Buddha, you meditate because you are Buddha. The Buddha reality, truly understood, is already within and around us. We see similar notions as well in certain Pure Land lineages, as well as this next figure, Nichiren. So Nichiren is one of my favorite people to study in Japanese Buddhist history. I sometimes have trouble getting my college students excited about him because he's a little rough around the edges. All right, but nonetheless, one of the most important, most interesting, and one of the bravest, religious reformers, I think we could say. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. Like Honen, Shinran, Eisai, Dogen, Nichiren began his career as a Hiezan monk, studying the Lotus Sutra. He supposedly also studied on Mount Koya, which is one of the great esoteric ritual training centers associated with the Shingon lineage. And according to some traditions, he also began his career as a Pure Land practitioner, but felt dissatisfied with that later on. Whereas Honen and Shinran emphasize the chanting of the name of Amitabha, Nichiren focuses on the chanting of the title of the Lotus Sutra. For both the reciters of the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, for the reciters of the Daimoku, Daimoku means title, the title of the Lotus Sutra, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo or Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. Both of these are kind of like dialing into the frequency of the universe, or that aspect of Buddha reality that guides all beings to awakening. It's a way of kind of harmonizing yourself with that, right? While some Buddhist traditions like Honen and Shinran's Jodo lineages emphasize devotion to Amitabha Buddha, Nichiren said, no, if this is the pure land of Amitabha, we should be, if this world is the pure land of Shakyamuni, we should be devoted to Shakyamuni Buddha. And, Nichiren even has these teachings about Pure Land rebirth at Vulture Peak, the site where the Buddha presented the Lotus Sutra to the world. While some traditions may have emphasized that you don't achieve awakening through your own effort, but rather through the practice of the Buddha, Nichiren emphasized the importance of practice, study, and devotion to the Lotus Sutra. He wrote the Risho on Kokuron, which is an important text that kind of critiques the government and so on. And he was banished, right? He was saying that, listen, the reason things are so chaotic is we're not embracing the Lotus Sutra, and that will fix, that will fix the problems of Japan. And to remonstrate the government at this time was a very dangerous thing. So that makes him very brave, in my opinion. So we're running out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and conclude there. This has been a very quick overview of some of the key figures in Japanese Buddhism. There are many more that we could talk about, and we could go into deep, detail for some of these different teachings. But perhaps we could share that, but we could save that for the discussion that will follow. So thank you so much.